The summoning of the fragile creature. The court of Vaeltherus had been built to make things feel small. That was not its official purpose, of course. Officially, the palace had been constructed over 8 centuries as a monument to draconic permanence, a declaration carved in obsidian and fire-tempered stone that the reign of the Ember Crown was not a temporary arrangement of the world but a geological fact, as fixed and unalterable as the mountains themselves. The vaulted ceilings soared high enough that storm clouds had on occasion formed near the upper arches. The corridors were wide enough for 3 mature dragons to walk abreast without their wing joints brushing the walls. The throne room, the heart of it all, the place where the weight of the empire pressed down hardest and most deliberately, was a space so vast that the far wall existed as a suggestion rather than a certainty, its details blurred by distance, and the perpetual low heat that radiated from the volcanic vents threaded through the palace's foundations like a slow pulse. Everything in Vaeltherus was designed, with exquisite architectural precision, to remind whatever entered it that it was small, that it was temporary, that the world had existed long before it arrived and would continue existing long after it had been forgotten. The irony, and it was an irony that only the oldest members of the court had the nerve to acknowledge, and only in the privacy of their own minds, was that the one thing currently being made to feel small by Vaeltherus was its own empress. Xarathen, the Ember Crown, she who had outlasted empires, the burning matriarch of the Eastern Reach, was dying. Not quickly, not the way lesser things died, with noise and struggle and an unseemly scramble toward the end. Dragons did not die dramatically unless they made a conscious choice to do so, and Xarathen had not survived 347 years of rule by indulging in unnecessary choices. She was dying the way stars died, slowly, from the interior outward, a collapse so measured and so deeply private that only those who had watched her for decades could detect the dimming. Her scales, which had once been the deep arterial red of freshly broken lava, the color of things still in the process of becoming, had begun to pale at their edges. Not gray exactly, not the silver of her eldest general, Mervith, who wore 3 centuries like a decoration, something subtler, a fading. As though the fire that had always lived just beneath the surface of her, the fire that had once lit the sky above the iron cities like a second sun, was slowly, quietly pulling back from the walls. Her flame still came when she called it. But there were mornings, early mornings, before the court assembled, before the day required anything of her, when she exhaled, and what emerged was smoke and heat and something thinner than it should have been. She knew it. She catalogued it privately, the way she catalogued all information that might one day be used against her, and she told no one. But her court knew, courts always knew. They were built for it, elaborate, attentive organisms designed to monitor the health of the thing at their center, because the health of that thing was the health of everything. Her generals knew. Her chamberlain knew. Her household staff knew in the way household staff always knew, through proximity and silence and the specific quality of a being's stillness when it thinks itself unobserved. No one spoke of it. That was the first law of Vaeltherus, older than any written edict. The Empress's vulnerabilities were not named. To name them was to make them real. To make them real was to invite the long, slow catastrophe of succession. It was High Chamberlain Vorek who broke the silence, and he did it the way he did everything, carefully, with an excess of delicacy and a complete absence of any real hope for how the conversation would be received. He chose the late afternoon for it, when the light through the palace's upper vents fell at angles that softened the volcanic glass of the throne room floor and made even the obsidian walls look, briefly, almost warm. He chose to stand at the prescribed formal distance of 6 respectful meters. He chose his words as one chooses footing on uncertain ground, testing each one before committing weight to it. "There is," Vorek said, "a human physician." The silence that followed was absolute. 2 of the household guards stationed at the room's periphery went slightly more still, the particular stillness of experienced attendants who had learned that visibility during sensitive moments was a liability. Xarathen did not move from the throne. She was coiled across it in the posture she had held for the better part of the afternoon, her great head resting on one foreleg, her tail wrapped around the throne's lower half with the casual, unconscious possessiveness of something that had occupied the same space for so long it had begun to merge with it. One amber eye tracked Vorek with the patience of a creature that had all the time in the world, and was choosing, for reasons of its own, to give some of it to this. "Say that again," she said. "A human physician," Vorek repeated. He did not flinch. He had served the Empress for 80 years, and he had long since accepted that there was a category of moments in her service that felt like standing at the edge of a very high place and choosing not to look down. In the eastern provinces, a doctor, there are accounts of him treating conditions that our own healers characterized as beyond intervention. "You want me," Xarathen said, in the way she said things when she wanted the full weight of the words to land before she continued, "to submit myself to the hands of a creature that lives for 80 years. I want your radiance," Vorek said carefully, "to live for 800 more." Another silence. This one longer and textured differently, not the silence of incoming anger but the silence of something being considered, which was, in some ways, more dangerous. "How did you find him?" she asked. "Reports," Vorek said, "from the border territories. He treated a merchant family when the gray fever came through. 7 afflicted, 6 recovered. The 7th was elderly and had refused treatment until too late." He paused. "He also treated a sea serpent, a juvenile infected claw. He charged the serpent at standard rates." Something shifted in the Empress's expression, not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to interest. "He charged it." "Itemized invoice apparently," the serpent paid. Xyrathen was quiet for a long moment. The heat from the vents made the air between them shimmer faintly, the kind of shimmer that in another context might have been the precursor to something being incinerated. "Bring him," she said finally. "If he arrives and he is foolish, we will not be inconvenienced for long." Vorek bowed deeply and with visible relief, and removed himself from the room before she could change her mind. Dr. Empress Savesh arrived at the gates of Vaeltharis on a gray horse, not a dramatic horse, not a white destrier or a creature that announced its rider's importance by the quality of its bearing. A serviceable gray horse with an even temperament and the calm, slightly resigned expression of an animal that had been on a great many journeys and expected to be on a great many more. Its rider matched it in this regard, a lean man of perhaps 40 years, dark-haired, dark-eyed, dressed in traveling clothes that were clean and practical and gave nothing away about how much money their owner might have. He carried a leather satchel over one shoulder, worn smooth at the strap from what was clearly years of habitual use. He had a notebook in his coat pocket. He had absolutely no visible armor. The 6 Dragonkin guards who met him at the gate were each 4 times his height, and outweighed him by a factor that did not bear close examination. They looked at the small human on his gray horse with expressions that hovered somewhere between professional neutrality and the faint bewilderment of soldiers confronted by something they had not been specifically trained to process. He looked back at them with the same quiet, assessing attention he gave everything, apparently, his dark eyes moving across them with interest rather than fear. He dismounted. He handed the reins to the groom who appeared from a side door. He adjusted the strap of his satchel. "Thank you for meeting me," he said to the guards as though they had done him a courtesy. "I understand I'm expected." They escorted him through the palace in a formation designed by architectural necessity to impress and unsettle. Past the murals depicting the incineration of human armies rendered in tile and gold leaf, past the corridor of victory trophies that included the crowns of 3 separate kingdoms and one very large skull that might have been decorative and might not have been, past the statuary of the great embers of prior generations, each carved twice the size of life, with expressions that suggested life size had always seemed like an underestimate. Empress Savash walked through all of it with his hands clasped behind his back and his head occasionally tilting upward to examine the architecture with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. He did not hurry. He did not drag his feet. He moved at the pace of a man accustomed to navigating unfamiliar spaces and considering them with attention before proceeding. The guards deposited him at the doors of the throne room, announced him by title and name in a voice built for announcement, and then opened the doors. The throne room of Vaeltharis in the late afternoon, with the volcanic light coming through at low angles and the heat shimmering in the air between the floor and the vented ceiling, and the great dark shape of the Empress coiled across her throne at the room's far end. It was the kind of sight that reorganized a person, not subtly. It reached into the chest and moved things around without asking permission, rearranged the furniture of the self to accommodate the fact that the world contained this, and had always contained this, and you simply hadn't been standing close enough before to understand the scale. Most men who had entered that room forgot, briefly, how their legs worked. One ambassador had wept, though he always claimed afterward that it had been the heat. Dr. Empress Savash walked in, stopped at a respectful distance, set down his satchel at his feet, and looked at the Empress with the same careful, measuring attention he had given everything since the gates. Then he said, "Good afternoon. I was told there's a respiratory presentation. May I approach?" The temperature in the room dropped several degrees in the span of a single breath, and then rose sharply, a fluctuation that was entirely involuntary, the physiological equivalent of a startled expression, the kind of reaction the Empress would have found embarrassing if she had believed the human capable of detecting and correctly interpreting it. He detected it. He took out his notebook and wrote something down. Xyrathen looked at the small creature standing in the middle of her throne room, with its small notebook and its complete, genuine, apparently unperformative absence of paralysis, and felt a sensation she had not experienced in a very long time, the specific, slightly uncomfortable feeling of being surprised. "You are smaller than I expected," she said. Her voice was the sound of stone shifting deep underground, the kind of sound that arrived in the chest before the ears understood it. He met her gaze without difficulty. "Most things are smaller than an empress," he replied, with a tone that carried no flattery and no apology, only the calm of a statement of observable fact. He picked up his satchel. "Where does it hurt?" She stared at him. In 347 years of rule, she had fielded questions from generals, from foreign monarchs, from scholars and supplicants and the occasional sacred oracle. She had been petitioned and argued with, and once memorably, challenged to a territorial dispute by a rival dragon who had since been buried under the eastern mountain pass he had been so determined to control. She had answered questions about policy and military strategy, and the theological implications of her rule, and the correct interpretation of 17 generations of dynastic law. Nothing with a heartbeat had ever asked her that question and expected her to answer it directly. Pain was not discussed. Pain was not acknowledged in public or private, not given air to breathe or space to exist in any form that could be witnessed. Pain was managed, suppressed, buried under layers of duty and bearing, and the absolute necessity of appearing to be exactly what she was supposed to be, which was invulnerable. To acknowledge pain was to offer it to anyone in the room who might be looking for a place to put a blade. She studied the human standing before her, the absolute steadiness of him, the way his hands rested loose at his sides, the way his breathing had not changed when the temperature in the room spiked, the way he held her gaze not with defiance, which she would have recognized and dealt with, but with simple, honest, professional attention, and she made a decision. Not a comfortable one. Not one she would have made in any other context for any other reason. But the Chamberlain's words had settled into her over the days since Vorak had spoken them, and she had not been able to dislodge them. "I want your radiance to live for 800 more." "Here," she said, and touched one claw with the deliberate care of something unaccustomed to the gesture, to the base of her own throat. He examined her for 2 hours. He was thorough in a way she had not expected, which was itself unexpected because she had not expected to have expectations about him at all. She had anticipated something quick and superficial, the kind of examination born of intimidation, conducted at a safe distance, producing a confident and useless verdict. What she received instead was methodical, precise, and entirely without performance. He asked about duration. How long had the changes been present? Was there a moment she could identify as a beginning, or had it felt gradual? Were there fluctuations, or was the trend consistent? He asked about triggers, heat, exertion, certain foods, certain seasons, emotional states. He said this last one neutrally, without the flinch of someone expecting to be incinerated for the question. He asked about sleep, about the quality of her flame at different times of day, about whether the paleness of the scales had started at the edges or the center. She answered. Each time she answered, she felt the strangeness of it, the odd, slightly exposed quality of offering information about her own body, her own limitations, her own diminishment to another living creature. But he received each answer without expression of alarm or satisfaction, without filing it away in any visible way as leverage or revelation. He wrote in his notebook. He asked the next question. He moved through the examination with the focused attention of someone whose entire interest was in the problem before them, and the problem was her health. And her health was not a weapon or a vulnerability or a political opportunity. It was simply a problem, and he was trying to solve it. His secondary eyelids closed once briefly, during a moment when she exhaled more smoke than she had intended, a small, embarrassing loss of control triggered by a question that had caught her off guard, and he didn't flinch. She waited for the flinch. It didn't come. He made a note and asked the follow-up question. At the end of the second hour, he stepped back, closed his notebook, and stood for a moment in the quiet way he seemed to default to when he was thinking, still but not tense, present but not performing presence. "I have some initial thoughts," he said, "but I'd like to review them properly before I share them. I don't want to tell you something I'm not certain of." He looked up at her. "May I return tomorrow?" "You may," she said. He bent to pick up his satchel. The gesture was automatic, unhurried. He was already half thinking about something else. She could tell his eyes had taken on the slightly inward quality of a person with a problem working itself at the back of their mind. She did not mean to speak again. She had intended to dismiss him. But the question was there before she had decided to ask it, the way some things were before the deciding was possible. "You are not afraid," she said. He paused, satchel in hand, and looked at her. He considered the question with the same seriousness he gave every question. "I'm quite afraid," he said. "You're the most powerful being I've ever stood in front of. The architecture alone is designed to remind me of that, and it's working." A brief pause, not uncomfortable, not weighted, just honest. "But being afraid of you doesn't mean I can't do my job, and your pain is not made less real by the fact that you're frightening." He looked at her steadily. "Nothing about you changes that calculus." He left, the sound of his footsteps faded down the long corridor, small and even and steady, until the silence of the throne room settled back into itself. Xyrathen did not move for a long time after he was gone. The volcanic vents breathed their slow heat into the room. The light changed as the afternoon died, the golden shafts from the upper openings shifting to amber and then to the deep, banked red of early evening. Somewhere in the palace, the change of guard was called, and the sound of it echoed through the walls, distant and familiar, the sound of the Empire continuing. She told herself the thing moving in her chest was only the pain. She was not sure by the time the darkness came that she believed herself. The insult and the thing that followed. The second day began with rain. Not the dramatic, lightning-split storms that sometimes rolled off the eastern mountains and threw themselves against the palace walls with the enthusiasm of something trying to make a point. This was quieter, a gray, persistent rain that arrived before dawn and settled in with the unhurried confidence of weather that had nowhere else to be. It silvered the obsidian towers of Valtharis and turned the training yards below the palace's upper terraces into shallow mirrors, reflecting nothing clearly, everything in smeared suggestion. Xyrathen watched it from the high arch of her private chamber, which opened onto a platform wide enough for her to spread her wings fully, though she had not spread them in several weeks, and the awareness of that restraint sat in her chest like something swallowed wrong. The morning air was damp and carrying the mineral smell of wet stone, the particular cold of high altitude that she had always found clarifying. She breathed it in, deliberately, the way her mother's mother had taught her, drawing the outside air through the secondary passages, letting it cool the interior chambers, settling the flame. It was a practice for composure. She had done it every morning for 3 centuries. This morning it worked less well than usual. She had slept poorly. She would not admit this to anyone, because there was no context in which the Ember Crown admitting to poor sleep did not carry political implications. But the fact of it was there in the slight heaviness behind her eyes, the way the morning felt slower and more resistant than it should. She had lain in the heat of her chamber for most of the dark hours turning over the previous afternoon, with the involuntary, slightly irritating quality of a mind that had found something it couldn't set down. Nothing about you changes that calculus. She had replayed the sentence more times than she would have found comfortable to enumerate, not because it had been flattering, it hadn't been, particularly not in the way flattery usually worked, with its careful appeal to pride and its implicit promise of alliance. It had been something else, something that sat differently. She tried in the analytical privacy of the pre-dawn dark to locate precisely what quality in those 7 words had lodged in her the way they had, and arrived at an answer that satisfied her about as much as the rain satisfied anything. He had said it as though it were simply true, not as a declaration or a reassurance or a bid for trust, as an observation, as a thing that had always been the case and required no particular acknowledgement to remain the case. She had been many things to many creatures in 300 years. She had been feared and obeyed and negotiated with and occasionally, rarely, carefully respected. She had been treated as a force of nature, as a political entity, as a military reality, as a symbol. She had been handled in all the ways powerful things were handled by the things that needed to exist alongside them. She could not immediately identify the last time someone had looked at her pain and treated it as the most important thing in the room. She did not examine this thought too closely. She set it aside, in the place where she put things that required more consideration than the present moment permitted, and she turned to face the morning. He arrived at the 2nd hour after dawn, when the rain had settled into its rhythm and showed no intention of stopping. The guards who escorted him through the corridors noted afterward, not to each other exactly, but in the particular shared silence of people who have witnessed the same thing and are processing it in parallel, that the human physician walked through the palace differently on the 2nd day. Not more comfortably, not with any relaxing of his attention, but with the quality of someone who had spent the night thinking and had arrived this morning in the middle of a thought, carrying it carefully the way one carried something that could not be set down without being lost. He came into the receiving chamber where Xyrathen had chosen to hold the consultation, smaller than the throne room, proportioned for interaction rather than ceremony, its walls heated by a network of vents that kept the air dry and warm even against the gray pull of the rain outside. And he set his satchel down, opened it, and extracted not his notebook but a second one, newer. Its pages already dense with notes written in a hand so small and close it looked like a different language from a distance. "I want to show you what I'm thinking," he said without preamble. "I'd rather you see the reasoning than just receive the conclusion." Xyrathen regarded him from across the chamber. She had not assumed the formal posture of the throne. There was no throne here, only the low-heated platform she used for resting, and she was coiled across it with the particular arrangement of a creature who had chosen a position and was reserving the right to change it. "Proceed," she said. He explained, not condescendingly, she noted this specifically, because condescension would have registered immediately, and she had already decided what she would do with it if it appeared. He explained the way one explained to someone whose understanding was assumed and whose engagement was invited, drawing on what she'd told him the day before, building a structure of reasoning from her own observations rather than replacing them with his. The inflammation he suspected in the deep respiratory passages. The interaction between her natural flame generation and what appeared to be a failure of the thermal regulation that should have made the two systems compatible. The secondary effects radiating outward from that central dysfunction, the scale discoloration, the fatigue, the involuntary fluctuations she had described. He had drawn diagrams, small precise diagrams in his notebook, cross-sectioned with the confident inaccuracy of someone who had studied anatomy that did not perfectly match the subject before them and was honest about the gaps. "I don't have a complete map," he said, tapping one diagram. "Draconic internal architecture isn't well documented in human medical literature. What I have is mostly inference from what you've described and what I observed yesterday. If I'm wrong about any of the underlying assumptions, I want you to tell me." "The diagram of the secondary flame chamber is incorrect," she said. "Show me." She considered him for a moment, the directness of the request, the complete absence of defensiveness in it. Then she told him where the diagram was wrong and what the correct arrangement was, and he listened with absolute attention and drew the correction in the margin with small, neat annotations. "Thank you," he said, "that changes the implication here." He made a further note, which actually makes more sense of this symptom pattern. They worked like that for an hour, her correcting his anatomy, him revising his conclusions, the two of them building something between them that had not existed before either of them arrived in the room. It was not comfortable exactly. She was not accustomed to collaboration, to the particular vulnerability of correcting and being thanked for the correction instead of resented for it. But it was something. It had a quality she was having difficulty nomming. By the end of the hour, he had a revised treatment framework. He explained it carefully, the preparations he would ask the palace alchemist to compound, the modifications to her schedule, the things he needed her to monitor and report. He spoke about the expected timeline with the honesty of someone who had decided that uncertainty offered to the patient was more useful than false confidence. "I think 6 to 8 weeks before we see meaningful change," he said, "possibly longer. I won't know until I see how you respond to the first phase. And if I do not respond well." He met her gaze steadily. "Then we reassess and try something else." A brief pause. "I don't have a version of this where I give up. I want to be clear about that." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away, not in dismissal, but in the manner of someone who has received something and needs a moment to put it somewhere. "Begin," she said. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them, which was itself surprising. Zarathan had not expected routine to be something the human brought with him, but it was a quiet, consistent rhythm of daily examinations and measured questions and the small ceramic cups of dark, revolting medicinal preparation that appeared each morning with the punctuality of the dawn guard change, and tasted, every single time without variation, like the memory of a swamp. "Still revolting," she told him on the 9th morning. "Still effective," he replied, making a note of something. "The palatability curve tends to plateau around the 2nd week. You stop expecting it to taste better." "Is that your idea of encouragement?" "It's my idea of accurate forecasting." He glanced up from the notebook. "Do you want encouragement or accuracy?" She considered. "Accuracy," she said. "Always accuracy." "Then yes, still revolting, probably always will be." He wrote something. "You're also sleeping better. Your respiratory rate this morning is down almost 12% from the first day." She filed this away. She had noticed the improvement in sleep herself, though she had not said so. It felt too much like admitting how poor it had been before. But he had noticed it through numbers, through the steady measurement of things she couldn't easily hide from careful observation, and there was something unexpectedly settling about that. About being seen by someone whose method of seeing didn't have an agenda attached to it. He was not servile. That continued to be the thing she returned to. Not servile, not intimidated into silence, not performing the elaborate deference that every other creature in the palace had long since adopted as the reflexive grammar of interaction with her. He was courteous, genuinely, consistently, in a way that suggested actual regard for her as something worth being courteous to, rather than the performed submission of something trying to avoid consequences. But he disagreed with her when she was wrong, and he did it without armor, without hedging, without the careful diplomatic cushioning that was everyone else's instinctive protection against the possibility that disagreement might be taken badly. On the 4th day, he had told her that her schedule was killing her. Not in those exact words. His exact words had been, Your current schedule of court proceedings and military reviews is aggressively counterproductive to recovery. The inflammatory process needs rest to resolve. You're not giving it rest. He had said it while reviewing his notes in the same tone he used for everything, as though the words had no particular charge. As though telling the Ember Crown that her behavior was counterproductive was a thing one simply said when it was true. She had looked at him with the gaze that had ended sieges. The gaze that had, on 3 separate historical occasions, caused foreign ambassadors to revise positions they had been certain were non-negotiable. The gaze that communicated, without requiring language, that the being on the receiving end of it was existing on a very short and specific tolerance. He looked back, not with defiance, not with the bright, slightly desperate energy of someone deciding to be brave. With patience. With the waiting quality of someone who had said a true thing and was prepared to wait as long as necessary for it to be acknowledged as true. Her generals, stationed at the periphery of the room, had the collective experience of men who had survived long service under the Ember Crown, which meant they had developed a finely calibrated sense of when the atmosphere in a room was about to change catastrophically. They measured the silence in heartbeats. "I understand that's not what you want to hear," Empress said into the silence. "It remains true." She held the gaze for another long moment. Then she looked away. "I will review the schedule with Vorek," she said. She reduced it by a third that afternoon. She hated that he was right. She found, to her considerable irritation, that having it was significantly less important than the fact of it. The crisis came in the 3rd week, on a morning when the weather had cleared and the sun lay hard and bright across the palace's upper terraces, the kind of morning that looked like good news from a distance. It arrived in the person of Lord Kivrath. He was a northern noble, minor territory, significant bloodline, the particular combination of ancient name and middling power that tended to produce, in those who carried it, either genuine humility or the kind of ambition that had decided humility was for creatures who couldn't afford better. Kivrath was the second kind. He had been watching Empress Savash move through the palace with growing access and growing frequency for 3 weeks, and he had been watching the court respond to this, not with discomfort, as he had expected and perhaps hoped for, but with the careful, attentive quiet of people observing something they hadn't classified yet. And he had made the decision that men like Kivrath always made eventually, which was that the moment had arrived to define it for them. He chose a full court session for it. All the generals, the upper nobility, the foreign attachés who were present that week, the household staff in their formal positions along the walls. The throne room in its full weight and ceremony, every element of Veiltherist doing its designed work of making things feel the gravity of their place in the order. Xyrathen sat the throne with the composed authority she had been practicing since before most of the creatures in the room had been born, and the session moved through its agenda with the measured efficiency of empire in operation. Kivrath waited. He was patient in the way of someone who had been rehearsing, who had the timing of it worked out in his head and was watching for his cue. He found it during a natural pause between agenda items, stood, and walked to the center of the floor with the deliberate gait of someone who had decided they were the most important thing happening in the room. "Your Radiance," he began, with a bow that was correct in angle and empty in meaning. "I ask the court's indulgence for an observation that I believe serves the Empire's dignity." Xyrathen's expression did not change. Her eye tracked him with the absolute stillness of something very old watching something considerably younger make a decision it cannot yet see the consequences of. "This court," Kivrath continued, his voice lifting now into the carrying register of someone who wanted the room, "has watched for 3 weeks as a human physician has been granted unprecedented access to her Radiance's presence, to her private chambers, to her person." He paused to let the words do their work. "I raise this not in ignorance of the circumstances, but in service of a question that I believe the court deserves to ask aloud." He turned, including the assembled nobles in his argument with a practiced, sweeping glance. "What does a creature that lives 80 years understand of our kind? What medical wisdom could possibly be contained in a lifespan so brief it would barely constitute a campaign season for those of us in this room?" Several nobles had gone very carefully neutral in their expressions. Several others had not, and the ones who hadn't were watching Kivrath with the particular attention of creatures calculating odds. "It is not the man's fault that he is what he is," Kivrath continued, with the generous magnanimity of someone preparing to be cruel. "A mammal cannot be expected to exceed its nature, but to bring such a creature into the innermost confidence of the Ember Crown, to allow it to handle, to examine, to prescribe, this is not medicine." He let the pause extend, let the room fill with what he was about to say before he said it. "It is embarrassment." The word landed exactly where he had placed it. He had worked on it. It was the right word for the purpose, not threatening, not aggressive, nothing that could be clearly charged as treasonous, just a soft, terrible word, embarrassment, the thing the Empress could not afford to be. Xyrathen had not moved. She would not move, not yet. She was watching what would happen next with the same stillness she brought to watching things she hadn't decided the outcome of. Empress Savash had been standing to the side of the hall, near the lesser noble's gallery, reviewing his notes in the brief pause of attention a full court session rarely provided. He had looked up when Kivreth began speaking. He had listened. His expression, through all of it, was the same expression it always was: attentive, still, processing. When Kivreth finished, the room held the particular quality of a held breath. Emre closed his notebook. He looked at Kivreth. He looked briefly at the Empress. And then he did something that nobody in that hall, not the generals, not the nobles, not Vorek, who had watched 80 years of court politics from 6 respectful meters away, not Xyrathen herself, who had believed she was past being surprised, had expected. He walked to the center of the floor. He stood beside Kivreth. He turned to face the assembled court, and his voice when he spoke was even and clear and carried without effort to every corner of the room. "Lord Kivreth raises a fair concern," he said. The silence that descended had a different quality than the silence before. Something had shifted in it. Several nobles exchanged glances with the speed of people trying to recalibrate very quickly. "He is right that I am short-lived," Imrek continued. "He is right that my understanding of draconic physiology was, until 3 weeks ago, almost entirely theoretical. He is right that there are real and significant limits to what I can offer. He was not performing humility. His tone had not changed from its baseline, measured, factual, carrying the same weight it carried when he was explaining a symptom pathway or correcting a dosage. I am a human doctor. I am not impressive by the scale of this court. I am fragile, I am brief, and I am working with incomplete information that I am filling in as I go." Kivrath's expression had acquired the slightly uncertain quality of a man who had prepared for resistance and was not sure what to do with agreement. "However," Imre said, a single word delivered without emphasis, without theatrical pause, simply placed the way a stone is placed on a scale. "Her radiance is ill." He looked at the assembled court, not at Kivreth now, at all of them, with an attention that was neither aggressive nor deferential but simply direct. "And the question before this court is not whether I am impressive. The question is whether she gets better. Those are different questions, and only one of them matters." He held the room's attention with the complete stillness of someone who was not asking for it but simply occupying it. "If there is a person in this hall with a better answer, with more effective treatment, with deeper knowledge of what is happening and how to address it, I would genuinely, earnestly like to hear from them. I have no investment in being the one who heals her. I have only the interest in her being healed." His gaze moved briefly to Kivreth, not with hostility, with the patient, honest attention he gave everything. "I know what I am. I'm a doctor, that's all, and my patient needs me to continue my work." The throne room was completely silent. Xyrathen sat very still on her throne, and something moved through her that she did not immediately have a word for. It was not quite surprise, though surprise was part of it. It was something deeper and more structural, the feeling of a thing she had believed to be fixed in a certain position shifting very slightly, just enough to show that the position had never been as fixed as she had assumed. He had walked into the center of her court. He had stood beside the man attacking him. He had conceded every point that could be made against him, his brevity, his limitations, his inadequacy by every measure this court used to measure things, and then with a single word he had turned the entire architecture of the argument inside out, not by defending himself, not by asserting his worth or his credentials or his right to be there, by making it simply and completely about her. He had not asked for protection. He had not appealed to her authority or hidden behind it. He had stood in the open, acknowledged everything that was true, and then said, "The only question that matters is whether she gets better, and I am working on that, and if anyone has a better answer, I am listening." It was the most effectively disarming thing she had seen in 347 years of watching creatures try to hold their ground. "Lord Kivreth," she said, her voice had the quiet of things that have decided. Not cold was a performance. This was simply final. "Sit down." Kivreth said, "Dr. Savesh." She looked at him across the width of the floor, this small, brief, entirely unarmored human who had just done something she was still working to fully understand. "Continue your work." He inclined his head, not a bow, not a performance, just the acknowledgement of something received. He returned to his place in the gallery. He picked up his notebook. The session continued. But Xyrathen, for the rest of that day and into the long evening after, found herself returning again and again to the moment in the center of the floor, to the stillness of him, to the absolute uncalculating quality of what he had done, not strategy, she was certain, not the kind of move that was worked out in advance, not the performance of a man playing to a room. Just the truth, stated plainly, by someone who had decided the truth was the only thing worth standing behind. She had seen courage many times. She had seen bravery, the bright, burning, slightly reckless thing that sent soldiers into impossible odds and sometimes won. She had seen defiance. She had seen dignity. She was not sure she had ever seen quite this before. This particular thing that had no armor in it at all and somehow needed none. She sat with it in the long dark of the evening, and outside the palace the stars came out over the obsidian towers, cold and fixed and burning in their own distant silence, and she found that she did not have a word for what she was feeling. She thought that might itself be worth something. The one thing she never expected. The recovery did not arrive the way she had imagined it would. She had imagined in the private, unguarded moments of the early weeks, when the treatment was new and she was still deciding whether to believe in it, that healing would feel like a restoration. Like something returning from wherever it had gone, stepping back through a door it had left open. She had imagined it as a reversal, a going back. The world setting itself right again in the way the world sometimes did when given the proper conditions and enough time. What it actually felt like, she discovered, was construction. Slow, incremental, slightly unglamorous construction. The kind that happened between observations rather than during them, the kind you only saw evidence of in retrospect, when you turned around and found that the thing you were standing in was larger than it had been before and you could not identify exactly when the change had occurred. She noticed it first in the mornings. The clarifying breath she had practiced since childhood, the one that had been working less well for months and then through the worst of it barely at all one morning in the fourth week it worked. Not dramatically, not with any announcement. She drew the cold morning air through, let it settle the flame, felt the chambers clear the way they were supposed to clear, and sat with the shock of something normal feeling new. She did not tell anyone. She sat with it in the private dark and felt something she had not been certain she would feel again. The next morning she tried it again, it worked again. By the end of the fifth week, her flame came back to her the way a tide came back, not all at once, not with the theatrical surge of something restored in a story, but incrementally in small daily increases that only made themselves obvious when she compared the present to a point far enough behind it. One morning she exhaled without thinking during a military review and the general nearest her stepped back reflexively, and she realized the heat of it had surprised him. Realized a moment later that it had surprised her too, that she had forgotten in the careful management of the previous months what her own flame felt like at its natural strength. The scale color returned more slowly. The edges, which had gone pale and thin as old paper, began to deepen again, first just the faintest darkening, so subtle that even she wasn't certain she wasn't imagining it, and then unmistakable, the deep arterial red coming back like color returning to something that had been too long in the cold. Vorik noticed. He said nothing, which was how she knew the improvement was real. He would not allow himself to remark upon it unless he was certain, because the Chamberlain had survived 80 years of service by never, under any circumstances, raising a hope that might not hold. But she caught him once, standing in the doorway of the receiving chamber after Imre had finished the morning consultation and left, looking at the space where the doctor had been with an expression she had never seen on Vorik's carefully managed face before. Something that might have been relief, if relief in a creature of his composure was allowed to be visible. She watched him from across the room and said nothing, and after a moment he became aware of her attention and arranged his expression back into its habitual neutrality. "Your radiance," he said. "Vorik," she said. A pause in which something was understood between them without being spoken, which was the only way things of that kind were allowed to exist in Vaeltheris. "Shall I inform the Northern Territories that the border review will proceed next month as scheduled?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He bowed and withdrew. She turned back to the window and something in her chest burned steady and clean. It was in the 6th week that the night happened, the one she would remember longest. The pain had been manageable for most of the treatment, the preparations helped, the schedule changes helped, and the improvements came often enough to make the difficult days feel temporary rather than permanent. But in the 6th week, 4 days before the review of her health was scheduled before the full court, something shifted badly in the space of an afternoon. She recognized it as it was happening, the familiar architecture of a flare, the inflammatory cascade her body had been performing for months suddenly spiking past the threshold where management was possible. And she managed the recognition with the composed practicality of someone who had been expecting the possibility and had prepared for it. What she had not prepared for was how much worse it was than the early weeks. She had assumed reasonably that 6 weeks of treatment would mean a less severe experience than the pre-treatment baseline. What she had not accounted for was that the treatment itself had revealed, by reducing the chronic background noise, how significant the acute peak still was. The chronic pain had been constant enough to become normalized. The acute peak, arriving now without that normalization, hit harder. She did not pace because packing was not a thing she permitted herself. She lay in her chamber and breathed through it with the technique Emre had shown her in the third week. The long, controlled exhale that released heat without triggering the feedback loop that made things worse, and she managed it, and the managing was its own kind of exhausting. Vorik sent for the doctor just past the midnight hour. She did not ask him to. She had not told him to have that instruction ready. Vorik had prepared it himself, had held it in reserve against this possibility because Vorik understood the court and its needs and the particular geometry of what was happening here in a way she sometimes suspected he understood better than she allowed herself to. She heard, distantly, the rapid steps of a messenger departing through the lower corridors, and she understood, and she said nothing. Emre arrived quickly enough that he must have been lightly sleeping or not sleeping, the prepared quickness of someone whose mind had stayed with the problem even after the working day was done. He came through the chamber door still pulling on his coat, his hair unsettled from sleep or from the wind of the night corridors, his satchel already in hand. He looked at her with the first glance of assessment, taking in the indicators he had trained himself to read over 6 weeks of close observation, and then he set the satchel down and came to work. He worked with the quiet efficiency of someone whose competence had been so thoroughly internalized it required no thought. He checked the indicators he always checked, adjusted the preparation dosage, asked questions in a voice kept low and unhurried. He moved around her with the ease of someone who had long since stopped performing comfort with her presence and had simply arrived at the reality of it. The reality of the large and the small existing in the same space with the same purpose, which was to make the pain stop. The worst of it passed sometime in the second hour. Not gone, it wouldn't be gone until morning, but lowered below the level that required active management, settled into something that could be waited out rather than fought. She shifted her position against the heated stone of the chamber wall, finding the particular angle that reduced the pressure on the respiratory chambers, and let herself rest with the careful quality of something that was not yet comfortable but was no longer in crisis. Emre sat on the low bench he had moved to the corner of the chamber in the second week, on a day when a longer examination had required a place to work through notes. He settled onto it with the unhurried quality of someone who had decided to stay, and he opened his notebook, and he began to write in the quiet light of the chamber's low flame vents. He did not leave. He did not make a show of staying. He did not announce it or look to her to acknowledge it or arrange his posture in a way that communicated his virtue. He simply stayed, sat in the corner of her chamber in the middle of the night and wrote his notes, the small scratch of his pen the only sound in the room besides the low breath of the vents and the distant, rain-soft sound of the palace at night. Zyrathen watched him from across the room for a long time. "Why?" she said eventually. He looked up from the notebook. "Why do you stay?" she said, not an accusation, not a challenge. Genuinely, the question she had been unable to not ask, arriving now in the quiet of the middle of the night where things that needed asking had more room to do so. You could return to your quarters, come back in the morning, no one would fault you for it. He considered the question. He considered it the way he considered all questions seriously, without performing the consideration, without rushing toward an answer he hadn't finished finding yet. His pen rested against the notebook page. The vent light moved across the angles of his face in a way that made him look, for a moment, older than his 40 years or perhaps just present in a way that age sometimes brought and sometimes didn't. "I don't want to," he said, "not because I'm not tired. It's past midnight and I have a full examination at dawn." A brief pause in which he seemed to be organizing the true answer rather than the convenient one. "But you're my patient and right now you're in pain and you're in pain alone and those are different kinds of difficult." He set the pen down. "I've seen what isolation does to people who are already fighting. The body is fighting. Having the mind fight isolation at the same time it costs something. It costs more than it should have to." She was quiet for a moment. "I have an entire court," she said. "A court watches," he said. "Being with someone is different from being watched." He said it without weight, without sentiment, clinically, almost in the way he said true things. It shouldn't be maybe, but it is. The chamber held the warmth of the vents, and the quiet of the late hour, and the specific quality of a shared space at a time when neither occupant had anything left to perform. She had spent 347 years in rooms full of creatures performing for her, oriented toward her, arranged in relation to her like iron filings to a pole. She could not immediately identify the last time she had been in a room with someone who was simply there, present. Not for her, not oriented around her, just occupying the same space with their own steady, private existence intact. She found that she did not want to fill it with words. They remained like that for a long time, the Empress against her heated stone, the doctor with his notebook, the night doing what nights did, and something happened in that silence that she would carry longer than anything said in it. She did not tell him this. She filed it away in the place she kept things that mattered too much to handle carelessly. "You will be compensated for the late hours," she said eventually. "Thank you," he said and picked up his pen. The morning of the court review arrived clear. Not the aggressive clarity of storms having passed, but a quiet, high, steady clarity. The kind of morning that made the obsidian towers look like they had been placed there specifically to interrupt the blue of the sky and were very pleased about it. The light came through the upper vents of the throne room at the particular angle that turned the volcanic glass floor into something that looked almost warm, and the hall filled with the Empire's gathered presence, generals and nobles and foreign attaches and household staff and the chamberlain in his formal robes, and all the complicated machinery of an empire performing the assessment of its own continuity. Zarathen sat the throne. She sat it the way she had sat it for 347 years, not performing the authority of it but simply occupying it, the way something occupies what it genuinely is. The difference this morning was in what she carried while sitting it. Her flame was present, not merely controlled, not merely contained, present, with the full, unsuppressed depth of something that had recovered its nature rather than merely managing its diminishment. When she breathed during the opening of the session, the warmth of it moved through the room in a way that made the nearest guard lean fractionally back on reflex, and she allowed herself in private a moment of satisfaction. Her scales were deep red again. Not fully, the recovery was not complete, and Imre had been careful about this, about honest expectations and the reality that some things took longer than others, and full restoration was a matter of months, not weeks. But the color was there, real and deepening, and the court saw it and the court knew what it meant. And the court received it with the collective exhale of an organism that had been holding something for a very long time and had just been permitted to let it go. The review was thorough. Imre had prepared documentation, careful, precise, medical in language, but translated through Vorek into the diplomatic register the court required. And the findings were presented, and the findings were good, and the hall received them with the specific, controlled relief of creatures who could not afford to let relief become visible until they were certain, and who were now finally certain. Zarathen answered the questions of her council with the full authority of a being in possession of itself. She noticed, watching their faces, the shift in how they carried themselves, the way something they had been holding in their bearing, some prepared posture of readiness for the worst, quietly released. They were not performing relief. They were experiencing it, privately, in the disciplined way of creatures who served long terms under powerful entities, and learned to keep the full range of their investment in the work mostly interior. She had always known they served her. She had not always let herself know how much. The review concluded. The documentation was filed. The formal proceedings that surrounded the event, the notations in the Empire's records, the notifications to the outer territories, the small bureaucratic mechanisms that translated a medical recovery into an institutional fact, these were set in motion by the Chamberlain's quiet efficiency, and the court began with the gradual quality of a tide to disperse. Emre Savaş was standing at the edge of the hall near the entrance through which he had first been escorted 6 weeks before. His satchel was at his feet. His work here was complete, and they both knew it, not because she was fully healed, but because the crisis had resolved, the direction was established, the remaining recovery was maintenance rather than intervention, and the palace healers, trained now by 6 weeks of working alongside him, were capable of continuing what he had begun. He had been clear about this himself in their final consultation 2 days before, with the same honest practicality he brought to everything. You don't need me for the next stage. You need consistency and time. I can leave you with both. She had not replied to this. She had made a note of something on the paper before her and changed the subject, and he had allowed the change with the tact of someone who understood what it was covering and chose not to uncover it. Now he stood at the edge of the hall as the court dispersed around him, and she watched him from the throne, and something moved through her chest that she had been not thinking about for several days now, with the disciplined intention of someone who knows that a thing thought too directly too soon will break before it can be understood. He was leaving today. This was correct. This was appropriate. His life was not here. His life was in the eastern provinces, in the gray horse and the worn satchel and the patients who needed him the way she had needed him, each of them brief and fragile and deserving of the same absolutely undivided, completely undefended attention he had brought to her. She was not the only thing that needed him. She had never been, and she had known this and respected it from the beginning, even when she had been unwilling to name what that respect meant. She would live for centuries more. She had said this to herself in the 6th week, in the quiet of a night when he had gone back to his quarters, and she had sat with the particular quality of his absence which was different from the absence of other things. She would live for centuries. He would live for decades. There was a mathematics to this that could not be altered by any amount of whatever this was. Whatever the past 6 weeks had made, in the space between a human physician and a dragon empress who had needed him and not known how to want the help before he came, and showed her what it looked like to give it without condition. She could not hold this for 800 years and not have the holding become the thing she was. But she could do this. She rose from the throne, not with ceremony, no announcement, no formal rising, no signal to the court to arrange itself for a ritual. Simply stood with the full presence of something that had decided. She walked to the center of the hall. The remaining nobles and generals who had not yet left paused where they were. Vorik, halfway to the door with a stack of documentation, stopped and turned. The guards along the walls went to attention without being told, the reflex of long training responding to the quality of what was happening before the mind had named it. Emre looked up from where he had bent to retrieve his satchel. She stopped at a distance that, in the court's formal geometry, meant nothing specific, but that she had calculated with the precision of something that knew the value of space and had chosen this one deliberately, close enough to make the intention clear, far enough that it was not performance, not theater, not ceremony. She looked at him across the distance. He looked back. She had given the bow of formal greeting to foreign monarchs. She had given the inclination of acknowledgement to great generals returning from campaigns that had held the empire's borders against odds that history would later judge impossible. She had given on 3 occasions in 300 years the formal bow of respect between equals, the rare specific gesture reserved for those whom the Ember Crown recognized as occupying in their own domain the kind of authority she occupied in hers. She had never in 347 years given the bow that she now gave. It was not the formal bow of equal powers. It was not the diplomatic gesture of alliance or acknowledgement. It was not calibrated to any register the court had a language for, which was perhaps why the room received it in such complete silence. Not even the sound of breath, for a moment, nothing but the still air of the throne room and the volcanic warmth and the light coming in at its long morning angle. She bowed her head not shallowly, not the minimal tilt of acknowledgement or the diplomatic degree of necessity. She lowered her head with the deliberate, unhurried quality of something choosing fully without reservation, without the protective irony of partial commitment, to honor the thing before her. Her neck curved, her great head came down, and she held it for a long moment in the oldest gesture her kind had, the one that meant, I see you, not your power or your title or your usefulness to me. You. And what you are is worth this. The court was absolutely still. The nobles who had turned back were very still. The generals were still. Vorik, by the door with his documentation, had the expression of a man watching something he had not believed he would live to see, and was in the process of understanding that it was real. Empress Savash looked at her. He was very still himself, not the stillness of shock, but the stillness of someone receiving something carefully, with the full attention it required. His dark eyes held hers, and for a moment there was nothing in the room but the two of them and the weight of what had just been given and received. Then he brought his fist to his chest, not the court's gesture, not the formal acknowledgement of the empire's rituals, but his own gesture, his people's gesture, the one that meant in his language what her bow had meant in hers, and he held it there for a moment. And his expression did something complicated and quiet that was not quite a smile and was not quite something else and was perhaps the truth of the space between them, the real name for the thing that had no clean name. He lowered his hand. He looked at her for a last long moment, with the complete, simple, undefended attention he had given her from the very first day, the attention that had never asked her to be smaller or larger than she was, that had met her pain as the most important thing in the room and treated it with the whole of himself. And then he picked up his satchel, adjusted the strap with the familiar motion of long habit, and turned and walked out of the throne room into the bright, clear morning beyond its doors. She listened to his footsteps until they faded. Small, even, steady. The court held its breath for a moment longer and then released it and began again to move, to speak, to become the ordinary busy machinery of an empire continuing. The documents were filed. The reviews were recorded. The great stone of Valtharis breathed its slow volcanic heat and went on being what it had always been. Zyrathen stood in the center of the throne room and did not move for a long time. She thought 80 years is not very long at all. She thought it will have to be enough, and it was, and it is. She thought some things do not need to last forever in order to have been the most important thing. And deep in the chambers of her, where the ember that was her had nearly gone dark and had been carefully, precisely, with the complete and undefended attention of a human doctor who had brought his whole self to the work, coaxed back to its full burning, something settled. Something she had not felt in so long she had begun to believe it was the youth of her that had carried it, a thing too fragile for centuries. Not fragile, she understood that now. Not fragile, only requiring sometimes the right kind of attention to remember how to burn. She stood in the light of the throne room and she burned, and it was enough.